What I'd like to do is go through a very brief overview on this first page of some of the key understandings of Islam, and then we'll turn to the primary sources and actually look at some scriptures from the Quran that I've chosen that I hope you'll find meaningful. As you're probably aware, Muhammad was born back in the late 500s AD, and when he grew up, he was married to a woman who was a very prestigious person who owned a camel caravan. She was a widow. They were married and lived a long and happy life together. Khadijah and Muhammad were very close, and their relationship meant a lot to them. One of the things that Muhammad liked to do was to go out and be by himself. All of us have times and places where we find it valuable and meaningful to focus on who we are and what we're all about and our relationship to the whole universe. Muhammad was one of those. It was when he was out in a cave outside of Mecca one time that he had the very first of a series of revelations, and we'll look at at that very first revelation as it came to be incorporated in the Quran. His revelations sounded an awful lot like what we would find in the writings of the great Hebrew prophets, people like Amos and Isaiah and Hosea and Jeremiah, those that were an inspiration to people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose hymn we always will associate with him that we sang just a few minutes ago. Themes of justice, of how God identifies with the weak, with the powerless, with the people who are oppressed, about how God calls us to live by a much higher standard than we might otherwise live, about how God identifies even with little baby girls who were being born and had almost no status in their society. God creates us all and accepts every single person as God's own child. Well, those kinds of messages were very different in the polytheistic society which he was a part of, a society which had no real commitment to God or to high values of any kind, had very little awareness of the kinds of truths that could guide their lives. Muhammad got a lot of opposition, but he formed a little community. It was called in Arabic an ummah, and that little community started with just 4 people. His wife Khadijah, an older, highly respected merchant named Abu Bakr, a young man who was his nephew and whom he kind of adopted as a son named Ali, and another young man named Zaid, who had been a slave. They formed the first community, and the community grew and grew as they came to realize how God's message was brought to them. They received permission to worship at the main shrine in Mecca known as the Kaaba. Kaaba is just an Arabic word that means cube, and this large cube-shaped structure would be a focus of pilgrimage for not only Muhammad's followers, but for many people throughout the history. They, however, received a lot of opposition because Muhammad was, they felt, demanding standards from God that they were not willing to live up to. And eventually Muhammad and his followers were forced to flee. They took refuge a couple of 100 miles away in a little city that came to be called Medina. The year was the year of the Common Era that we would call 622, and that came to be the year 1 in the Islamic calendar, the year 1 after the Hijrah, after the flight from Mecca to Medina. And for the next decade or so, they lived in tension. Would they be able to survive? Could that little ummah continue to flourish? Muhammad felt that his message was for all people and not just for a very small group. He wanted to proclaim it to everyone, and he felt that God was calling him to give that kind of message. Finally, after having to fight for their very existence a number of times, they were able to return to Mecca, and there Muhammad purified the temple, the Kaaba, dedicated it to the worship of the one God, and sought to establish bridges to people whom he called people of the book, especially Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, all of whom had Scripture. And he felt that just as God had given him a message to proclaim to the world, and that message would be someday written down as Scripture, so also those people who shared Scripture with each other and shared the revelation of God were those to whom he felt closest, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, people of the ancient Persian religion. After living in Mecca for some time and being able to establish Islam as a worldwide religion, Muhammad died very satisfied that he had carried out God's will for his life. His final message was, all Muslims are brothers and sisters. He wanted to show the worldwide nature of the religion which he had established. Well, what does that religion believe? What are the basic elements of it? One of them, of course, is monotheism, a basic affirmation that God is one, and that we find God relating to our whole world, that God is concerned about human beings, God is involved in our lives, and God has given Scripture, God has given God's own word to be able to proclaim that. God has also given us prophets, given us messengers who are called by God to proclaim the truths that are eternal truths. Those messengers include people like Abraham and Moses and Noah and John the Baptist and Jesus, as well as Muhammad. Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, the very last one of the prophets in this long series of messengers of God. Jesus himself is seen as having been born of the Virgin Mary, and Mary is very highly honored throughout the Quran. She is proclaimed as being the one who was chosen by God to give birth to the prophet Jesus, the Messiah Jesus. And among a number of women that are respected and revered in the Quran, Mary occupies a very high role. In terms of ethics, Islam shares with Judaism and Christianity many of the same kinds of standards. It shares with Judaism a concern for living a pure and healthy lifestyle, and thus Muslims, like Jews, abstain from pork. Unlike Jews, they also abstain from alcohol. Like Christians, they recognize that God's will is revealed through a variety of prophets that are not only from the 600s, 700s, 800s BCE, but even come at later times. And if you were to read through a number of passages from the Quran, you would find a lot of similarities, not only to the teachings of the prophets in Jewish scripture, but also to the teachings of Jesus as well. Like Christians, Muslims have an emphasis that after death we will be judged. We will face the consequences of the life that we have lived. And Muslims have a very strong emphasis on Judgment Day. And so there are similarities to Judaism and similarities to Christianity. There are some key differences, too, that I'll talk about in a moment. Many Jews live by what is informally called the 5 pillars of Islam. They're not spelled out in the Quran, but many Muslims live by the 5 pillars of Islam. Although they're not formally spelled out, most Muslims would say these are the guidelines that we see as important for our lives. First of all, the affirmation of the oneness of God and that Muhammad is his prophet. Second, and they're in no particular order, that all Muslims are called upon to help the poor, are called upon to share with others, because we all receive the material gifts of this life from God. And it's not simply a nice feeling, says Islam. It's our basic duty that God has built within us. I was very pleased when the announcement was made about the collections for various groups, including Ecumenical Faith in Action. It was a real good article in today's paper about Faith in Action, if you've not yet seen that. My wife and I enjoy volunteering there, and It and many other community service agencies are really fulfilling much the same kind of thing that the pillar of almsgiving prescribes in Islam as well. Another pillar within Islam is prayer. There is a traditional account, not described in the Quran, but it comes as a part of Islamic legend, that Muhammad woke up one morning and found a winged horse there. And this is, we assume, a visionary account. A winged horse who had the face of a woman and the rear end of a horse. I dated a girl like that once. No, I'm sorry. Forget that. In any case, this winged horse took him on her back, flew with him to Jerusalem, and there Muhammad prayed at the rocky outcropping where Solomon had built the very first Jewish temple. It, of course, had been destroyed, and the second temple had been destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So it was only a vast open area, but it was a holy area. And then the horse took one giant leap and carried Muhammad up through the seven heavens. Today there is a mosque called the Dome of the Rock that's built over that rocky outcropping, and you may go into the mosque. It's not off limits to non-Muslims. Out of respect, you take off your shoes and leave them outside the mosque with the shoes of all other worshipers, just as Moses at the burning bush was ordered to take off his sandals. And you may go there and see that rocky outcropping. There's a fence around it, but you can reach in and even touch it. And if you look very carefully with the eyes of faith, it's said that you can see the hoof print where the horse took off to take Muhammad up through the seven heavens. I've been there twice, and I haven't seen the hoof print either time, but it may be that if you go to the Dome of the Rock when we have peace in the Middle East, then you can go to Jerusalem and see that. Well, Muhammad came close to the very presence of God, and God asked that all his followers pray to him 50 times a day. Muhammad, kind of like Abraham in the Old Testament story, bargained God down to 5 times a day. And so today, throughout the world, at the first thing in the morning, in fact, in Beirut, Lebanon, I got waked up every morning about 4:30 or 5 in the morning by the muezzin calling the faithful to prayer. Early in the morning, at noon, at mid-afternoon, around sunset, and right before going to bed, Muslims all over the world turn towards Mecca and pray to God, following this ancient tradition that had been established by Muhammad so many years ago. And so prayer 5 times a day is one of those 5 pillars. And I've seen people just stop whatever they were doing. It only takes a couple of minutes, but it's a way of showing true devotion to God that most of us would not be able to do 5 times a day, day in and day out. And it's a recognition of the real commitment that people make to Islam. Another pillar of Islam that you heard about not too long ago when it was Ramadan was, of course, the fasting during the month of Ramadan from sunset to sundown each day. And then so that meals can be eaten before sunrise and after sunset. But during the day, it's a way of emphasizing the devotion and commitment to God that a person has. And then the 5th pillar is, of course, pilgrimage to Mecca. And every Muslim hopes that at some point in his or her life, either they will go or somebody from their town can go so that they can share, at least vicariously, in the pilgrimage to be a part of the reenactment of the ancient stories and traditions. Islam is not a monolithic religion. It has various groups within it, among whom you know about Sunnis and Shiites, especially from the events in Iraq today. But Islam is like a mosaic. Just as you all dropped pebbles in the water this morning to recognize joys and concerns, if you go to the Middle East, you'll find some mosaics that have been there for hundreds and even thousands of years. Little pebbles, little bits of colored stone. If you look at those individual pebbles, they have no particular meaning. Some of them are pretty colors and some of them aren't. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, you recognize that each of those individual components is important, and they all help to make up the whole picture. And it's that whole picture that lasts throughout the centuries. So I hope as you look at Islam, you look at it not as one great big monolith, one great big rock, but look at the little pebbles. I know that you and this congregation would never judge all Muslims as being terrorists, militants, radical Muslims, extremists, fanatics, the kind of way that sometimes in the media and in political cartoons, stereotypes are given. And I appreciate the Unitarian Universalist approach to understanding of all different faiths and a recognition of the varieties of understanding to which God has called us. And I appreciate the way in which you all carry this message to others. You're aware of the kind of mosaic. And so I want to give you a few more bits of stone for that mosaic. If you'll turn to the second page in your handout, let's look at a few of these selections from the Quran. First of all, look at the one that I've called the very first revelation to Muhammad. Here are the words that Muhammad received in the cave on that very first time that God ever spoke to him. And later on he realized that the angel Gabriel was the mouthpiece, the public address system, we might say, through whom this message came to him. Recite. And the word Quran just means recite. And so many Muslims like to memorize portions and recite them. Recite in the name of your Lord who creates. He creates a human being out of a tiny speck. When we think back to what we were at the very beginning of our lives, how small, how tiny we were, those 9 months that we spent in our mother's womb growing and developing, it's God that saw what we could be. God that created all the potential to become what complex persons we are today. And that first revelation was a way of affirming God's ability to create such beings as us out of the very tiniest little thing that can hardly even be seen. And the second part of that revelation, recite, your Lord is most bountiful. He teaches with pen and ink what people have not known. One of the things that I've enjoyed most during my 35 years of teaching has been helping people to look at the scriptures, the writing, the traditions that have lasted over so long from many of the world's great religions. Helping to study the Vedas. Last time I spoke here, I shared with you all on Hinduism, and I shared with you some of the insights from the Vedas and the Upanishads. Helping people to recognize in the Buddhist canon, the three baskets, some of the basic truths about what we are as human beings, what makes us up. Helping to gain insight from the wisdom of Confucius, who said things like, what you don't want other people to do to you, don't do to them. Sound familiar? And there are many of those great truths that are found in the scriptures of the world. And this second part of Muhammad's revelation to me means a lot. It means that as we look in the sacred writings of the world's religions, we find truths that speak to us because they are eternal. They have ways to guide us. They don't answer all our questions. Some of the greatest writings, to me, the book of Job is one of the greatest writings in the whole of the Jewish and Christian Bible. Job doesn't give us answers at all. Instead, it helps us to pose questions in a way to recognize what the limits of our knowledge may be. But this twofold revelation to me is very meaningful. And then every little chapter in the Quran opens with a phrase, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The compassionate, the merciful. Literally, the wording that's used means God's very inner self is moved. Something about God's inner being reaches out towards us. And in this section called the opening that is memorized by Muslims somewhat the way the Lord's Prayer is memorized by Christians, the worshiper says, guide us to the straight path. That is, give us guidelines that we can follow. And those guidelines are to be found not only in the Quran, but in the traditions that arose after the time of Muhammad that helped to give people examples of how it was that they are to live. The section on creation gives a beautiful kind of description that shows how God's intention for the world is such a positive intention. One of the things that we do in a foundational course we have for all students at Emory and Henry is to look at creation stories of ancient traditions, the creation stories that come from ancient Babylon, the creation stories that come from various African cultures, a creation story that comes from Hinduism, a creation story that comes from modern-day physics. And we try to see what insights can be found in those creation stories that help us to understand ourselves. And then I've given you a little section from the chapter that's entitled Women in the Quran. The understanding of women in Islam is very important. It shows respect and honor, and especially the relationship between a man and a wife as being a very sacred kind of relationship. On the next page, at the top of the page, I included the little portion that you might hear in a somewhat controversial form. This revelation came to guide people living in a society where a man could have as many wives as he wanted. He could treat them simply as objects, as persons without any rights. The Quran gives to women very clear rights, and it set a limit on the number of wives that a man may have. Notice it says that a person may marry up to 4 wives. Now, I was at the Sea of Galilee one day, and I saw this tiny little car about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle got out. And this guy got out of it, and his wife got out, and his wife got out, and his wife got out, and his wife got out. And it reminded me of that old elephant joke. How do you get 5 elephants into a Volkswagen? And the answer is 3 in the front, 3 in the back seat, 2 in the front seat. I didn't see how they crammed in there. But that man had up to the maximum of 4 wives, but notice the limit that's put on it. If you cannot treat them all equally, then you should marry only one woman. My wife and I have been married 42 years now. I think if I had a second wife and a third wife and a fourth wife, I would find it very difficult to treat them all equally. And this limit in the Quran is a practical limit. We human beings relate to each other one-on-one in an equal fashion with very complex sets of relationships. We've come to understand each other over these 42 years and know how each other ticks and know what to do when we get mad at each other and so forth. What Muhammad was saying in this revelation is, take your married relationship seriously. And don't think that you're going to treat a partner just as somebody that you can use and shuck off when you get tired of them. Elizabeth Taylor is a great actress, and I enjoyed it a lot when Elizabeth Taylor came to speak at Emory and Henry several years ago. I remember her driving up in her white Cadillac and getting out, and she was very much a presence. They made her an honorary cafeteria worker in the cafeteria line in the library, and she put on a little cap. It was really cool. I admired her a lot, and I've enjoyed her acting. I've gone back a couple of times and watched the old National Velvet movie from when she was 12 years old. But Elizabeth Taylor is not a model on how to relationship to a man in her life. As you know, she's been married quite a number of times and has not learned how to relate over the long haul to a person with understanding. And so there are those of us that have different kinds of gifts, and obviously there are persons who need more of a limitation on their relationship to others, and the Quran describes that. And then I gave you a little section on Judgment Day. Notice here that Islam is a religion which focuses on living up to the very highest standards and saying that regardless of who you are, a Muslim, a Jew, a Zoroastrian, a Christian, if you live in such a way that when you are called to account for your life, then at the end of time, from every gate angels will come to you saying, "Peace to you because all that you have endured. Blessed is the reward of paradise." And the Quran has all kinds of very vivid descriptions of what paradise will be like, as many religions have. But the focus should not be so much on the vivid descriptions as on what it is that enables us to receive that kind of reward. And then the last part that I had was a section on Jesus. There are a number of sections on Jesus in the Quran. Notice that when the angel Gabriel, and in this passage it's just called the angels, but in another place it's defined as the angel Gabriel. When the angel Gabriel announced to the Virgin Mary that she would give birth to a child who would have a very important role as God's messenger, she questioned why she should be the one chosen. And the angel replied, "That is how God creates what he wills. When God decides on something, he only has to say, 'Be,' and it is." And this is a reminder, of course, of that creation story. There was darkness, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And Jesus was given the task of carrying God's message to the world, of healing people, of gathering around him a group of disciples. For Muslims, that is a very important aspect of God's ministry through Jesus. But there's one crucial difference between the Muslim understanding and the Christian understanding of what happened in Jesus' ministry. And there's one little verse in the Quran that spells out that difference. According to the Quran, Jesus was not crucified. He did not die on the cross. And so while Jesus is a great messenger, a healer, a teacher, a prophet of God, he did not die on the cross. People thought they had crucified him, but they did not. God took him to himself, according to the Quran. And so there is no central role for Good Friday, and of course that means there is no central role for Easter Sunday in Islam. There is one of the crucial differences between a Christian understanding and a Muslim understanding.